So I think we'll get started. So yeah, welcome to the final in this season's Tyndall Manchester seminar series. So during the seminar series, it's a full seminar series where we hear from kind of leading practitioners and academics in the field of climate action. And this afternoon, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Henry McGhie as this afternoon's speaker. So Henry was originally an ecologist, and it kind of became part of the Tyndall family, as it were, I suppose, during 2016, when he was head curator at Manchester Museum, and we became involved in the climate control exhibition. And I think the thing that really struck me about the climate control is that it was very much set up as a kind of a space that kind of offered an open invitation to people working to advance climate action, to use the space to kind of seed conversations, to drive action and inspire change. And Henry then left the museum in 2019 and has set up his own organisation called Curating Tomorrow, where he's very much kind of carrying on in that tradition of working with museums and in partnerships to drive forward climate action and actions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Henry, who will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will open it up for conversations and discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sarah, and I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see this okay. And I think to say that welcome to the Tyndall family is an especially nice way to think about it. Because with the challenges of sustainable development, as I'll talk about, they need all people, but we need to find the ways to work together and to play our part and to understand one another's perspectives. And just to kind of pick up on what Sarah had said there, like my background was as an ecologist, and then quite quickly after that, I realized, well, science isn't enough. And so I worked in museums and I thought, well, education as well, that's what we need. And I realized, well, education as well isn't enough, and research isn't enough, and policy isn't enough. We need all of them together to kind of to speak to one another. And so what I'm going to talk about is some of the potential of museums, both in their existing forms and what we could think of as a kind of expanded roles of museums. And I used to use a similar slide to this that said, you know, museums, 55,000 ways to address climate change. The number of museums has gone up very dramatically. So it's now estimated there are about 95,000 around the world. So they are a kind of existing infrastructure. If you were to say to someone, oh, well, I'm doing something with a museum, or I'm going to a museum, no matter what part of the world you were in, you would have some kind of sense of the things that you would be doing. But they're all very different as well. So the images here show, on the left-hand side is the Stavanger oil museum, petroleum museum, which is built in the shape of an oil rig. Then we have the bird collection at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, huge and very famous photograph of a woman called Roxy Laybourne with the collection there. The top one with the big circle is the Hong Kong Jockey Club Climate Museum in Hong Kong, obviously. Then below that, the big ship is Fridtjof Nansen's very famous ship called the, which he tried to sail over the North Pole in the late 19th century, and then Amundsen took to the South Pole. And on the right hand is a more modern museum, which opened in 2016, called the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro. Very, very fantastic building with very few objects in it, but a fantastic place. And so what have museums and heritage got to do with climate action? It's like, well, actually, they were really there right from the start. So the person in the photograph is a Maltese academic called David Attard. And back in the late 80s, at the time when the Brundtland report was produced, people were starting to get really worried about climate. And he was saying, we need to think about this idea of whether as a world heritage as something we pass on to the future. And really that really fantastic idea really captured something. This was his letter to the Times, saying that we need some kind of international agreement because the activity in one country doesn't stop at the borders of that country. It has an impact all around the world, things that we're very familiar with now. And then this led later that year, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Vincent Tabon, he spoke at the UN, and this led to this recognition of this passing that we need to protect the climate for the present and future generations of mankind, of humankind. So we could say that this concept of heritage and weather as a heritage was really very instrumental back in the 1980s, setting the pathway, the course for all of the Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992, Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement from 2015. And we might also think that, well, when people talk about the Framework Convention, they're like, well, what is this Framework Convention? Surely it's a huge document, it's very complicated, it's only for politicians, is actually quite misleading, because the original Framework Convention, it's only about 25 pages long, as is the Paris Agreement. And one of the less well-known parts of the Framework Convention is this thing called Article 6, not to be confused with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is something completely different. So even back in 1992, right at the very start of all of this activity, there was a recognition by all of the governments that we need to support these 6 activities: education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation in climate change matters. So all of the governments already agreed that in 1992, and I think it also has to be said that kind of not enough has happened, but let's not dwell too much on that. And so I want to pass to a slightly different idea now, like how museums and so on relate to this, that we often think of museums as places that preserve the past. And in a way, this is a very misleading idea of museums. Of course, that's part of the story, but the reason that we preserve these things is because they are part of the kind of resources for society and society's development. And so this is one of my collaborators, is Professor Rodney Harrison at UCL, Professor of Heritage Studies. And he and his colleagues developed this idea that the decisions that we make today about heritage, they either open or they close future opportunities. So we can think of heritage as a bit like Christmas. Christmas, you can either focus on what you receive or what you give. We can think about heritage in the same way. Is heritage something that we aim to receive from the past and pass on? But what will people need, and what would they even want, particularly in the context of a changing world? And just a slightly humorous image here was from it was the last exhibition I did at Manchester Museum, actually, was like, can we be sure that the future will value the things that we're passing on to it, or will it just be some kind of like Christmas jumper that you'd rather forget about? So it encourages us to think about, well, what is the future that we're trying to create? Who gets to decide any of this, and what will people need, and what do we need to do now to resource that future? It's a great idea. And so these are my kind of ideas for how museums can contribute to sustainable development, including climate action. And because you can see the flag behind me here, I'm very, very into the Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of blueprint for sustainable development action. And I thought about this for a long time, and I wrote this guide back in 2019 to help museums get started with sustainable development. And I thought about, well, what are the goals, what are the targets, and what are the things that museums do, and how can we put these things together? And so I got it down to kind of 7 key activities that museums already more or less do, which can be lined up with the goals and targets. So around protecting and safeguarding cultural and natural heritage, supporting education for climate action, promoting cultural participation for everyone, supporting sustainable tourism, because tourism has very negative impacts, enabling research for climate action, making sure museums' internal everyday decisions are also up to the mark and are playing their part to address climate change, and having effective external partnerships and collaborations for climate action, because we can achieve more together than any of us can achieve alone. And so just to give a few examples, this was the exhibition that Sarah mentioned we worked on back in 2016. It was part of Manchester's time as European City of Science, and I headed this up, and we had a grant from the EPSRC to develop activities. We developed it along with the agency that was responsible for climate policy in Manchester. And it's really not at all the idea that a museum is a place where you go and look at old things and maybe learn some things and you go home. That's not at all what we were interested in. The exhibition that you can see in the top right is divided into two, where you either explore the past or you explore the future. And there were lots of opportunities for people to let one another know what matters to them, because one of the kind of core ideas is that in society we don't often have so many opportunities to understand what one another think or care about. It was a great exhibition. It was very enjoyable to work on. And then just some of the other quite crazy museums there are around the world. So this isn't actually, so when I see this image, I thought it was a computer generated image. It's in Jostedal National, it's in Jostedal National Park in Norway. There's a glacier in the background, and the museum extends under the ground several floors to help people to both understand about glaciers and the impact of climate change on them, and also how glacier retreat is one of the key bits of evidence we have for the impacts of climate change. This, again, is a very unconventional museum, is in Germany, called the Klima House. It's situated on 8 degrees east of longitude. And what you do is you go around the building, and it's as if you go around the world. And each room has a different temperature and a different environment. They have a lot of partnerships. It's a very, very, very fascinating place. And it's also interesting because it was developed in Bremerhaven to boost tourism, because Bremerhaven was actually a city very much like Liverpool. There was a post-industrial dock that people didn't really know what to do with, so they developed the world's first climate museum, which seemed to me a very, very good and positive use of space. And then just to say that I wanted to show this because often when people would talk about climate change in museums, they would say, oh, well, who's doing this really well? And that often then becomes a discussion about who's got money and who's got resources. And so this is pretty much one of the smallest museums I've ever come across. This is called the Lata Milk Platform Museum in Finland. And through a very short mental exercise, you can connect this with probably about half of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a place where people used to pick up their milk churns from or drop off their milk. It's now a heritage site. So we can, of course, think about tourism. We could think about the relationship between industry and climate. We could think about gender equality, who was producing the milk, and so on. And also, of course, our diets and the requirements of climate change for a climate-friendly diet. But also to say that museums are not just places where people visit exhibitions or take part in events, that the collections that they house, these huge, fantastic collections, which are often, unfortunately, very underfunded and under-recognized, are really something that they're kind of four-dimensional. They enable us to explore nature through time. So this was a survey that was done by someone very forward-looking. Joseph Grinnell ran these big surveys in the early part of the 20th century with a view that people could resurvey those areas in the future. And this has actually proved to be extremely useful because the collections which were stored away 100 years ago scientists now can go back and ask questions of them that couldn't even have been imagined 100 years ago. So these collections help to demonstrate that species such as these little chipmunks, there are different species of chipmunks live at different altitudes, that the high level chipmunks are disappearing and being replaced by the lower elevation ones. And also that about when the populations get fragmented, it helps us understand what their conservation requirements to enable them to persist and not to become extinct. So as I say, I love this idea that museums, the collections are a kind of time machine. They help us go back into time and ask questions about the past to understand our present and our future. And to say that international cooperation, one of the things I mentioned and that's in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, isn't just for governments, it's for all of us. So on the two images we've got here, on the left-hand side was a conference in Tokyo in 2017, when the World Science Museum Network signed up to the SDGs and said, yeah, this is an important thing, we need to support this. And then on the right-hand side was a conference, and I'm pretty sure I can see Sarah there in the middle. That was, although it's not a large number of people, we managed to bring together people from the UN, from the IPCC, and as well, lots of those of us who are really very committed to climate action through museums and cultural institutions. And although we can achieve some things over Zoom and Skype, sometimes there just is no, there's nothing better than getting together and just shooting ideas around and trying to find fellow travelers for the work. And to say there are plenty of networks that people can join in museums. Really the biggest one is the International Council of Museums, more than 35,000 members. We have NEMO, Network of European Museum Organizations, and just as an example of a science centre network is Excite. But there are a number of these networks that people from different special interests within museums are part of. There are networks for educators, for conservators, and more. And so just to show that one of the things I am most proud of, if that's not too vain a word to use, is trying to help make the connections between museums and the Paris Agreement. And so for every year, there's a thing called the Action for Climate Empowerment Dialogue, which is part of the Framework Convention. Although it's not part of the negotiations, it helps to, because there are a lot of negotiators there, it helps them to understand, well, what is the role of non-state actors such as museums? And so in the front row there, we have Patricia Espinosa, and also in the front row is Adriana Valenzuela from UN, well, no longer with UNFCCC, who was really very instrumental in bringing these dialogues together, really trying to help to narrow the gap between policy and people's lived experience. And this led in 2018, there was a decision that was adopted by the governments, that the countries that are signatories to the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. And we can think of this as it's the kind of practical, the how-to of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement's from 2015. It doesn't actually tell you how to do it. It says what we need to do, but not how. And so at COP24 in Katowice, there was this recognition that, you know, governments acknowledge the importance of a range of stakeholders in achieving this thing, action for climate empowerment. That governments can't do this stuff. They don't have the relationships, the on the ground action. They're just too remote from people's lives, that we need all sectors to play their part. And so just to give an example of the importance of this, and also of the great value of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are two photos taken in the same place. So the one on the top left is when the Kyoto Protocol was agreed in 1997. The one on the bottom is when ICOM, the International Council of Museums, adopted this thing called the Resolution on Sustainability and supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, it's great that ICOM has adopted these Sustainable Development Goals. The thing that's a shame is it's taken us nearly 30 years. So we just need to find the ways to work together and the goal-based approaches and so on that just help us move much, much faster. I have to say also, it was one of the most terrifying talks I've ever had to do was in ICOM, because it was the biggest audience I've ever had to talk to. And we weren't allowed to check the room out first because the Crown Prince was in before us, but it's a long story. Very fantastic building. And so just to move on to COP, because we obviously Glasgow will be host of COP in early November this year. This was at the last COP in Madrid, although it had been supposed to be in Santiago. And the COP is a huge thing. It's absolutely enormous. It's a bit, I thought I would say something just to explain a little bit how it works. It's that in COP is a bit like, I think of it like an onion. There is a kind of very core central bit to it is the negotiators, but there are lots of different layers to it. And people are there for many different reasons. And this was one of the big plenaries that they have in the early morning that might have maybe have 3,000-4,000 people at them. But it's just to say that COP is really important, of course, but action doesn't just happen at COP, and we shouldn't just allow politicians to make all of the decisions. We should also make sure that our needs and aspirations, people know about them, and our representatives know about them. And so this brings us to a project I've been involved in called Reimagining Museums for Climate Action, which was initiated by Rodney Harrison, who I mentioned earlier, working with me, and Colin Sterling is another academic who's at the University of Amsterdam, and a couple of others. And we've been working with Glasgow Science Centre, which will be the green zone for the COP. And we launched this last year, linked very much to the ideas of that Article 6 I mentioned from the Framework Convention about participation. And to get around the idea that a museum is a physical place that people visit. We also want to explore different ways of even thinking about museums. And so we set a challenge last year, and we set it up as a competition, asking designers and architects and academics, artists, poets, philosophers, writers, museum professionals, Indigenous groups, community groups, and the public at large to radically reimagine and redesign the museum as an institution to help bring about more equitable and sustainable futures in the climate change era. And we wanted to do this because it may be that the institutions that we have, they're also in a way responsible for the world that we have. It may be that they are not quite the institutions that are going to be able to provide the future that we need. So the way we thought about this was either how to kind of twist existing museums into new shapes, or to imagine completely new forms of institution. And by institution, I don't just mean buildings, we mean functions and relationships and partnerships. And so although it was in the relatively early days of the pandemic, it was last May we launched the, May before last, we launched the competition. We had 264 entries from 48 countries, and then 8 teams were given £2,500 each to develop an exhibit. And we've also developed a website. It's actually, the website is live now, and we aim for it to be a kind of inspiration for both the museum sector and for other sectors before, during, and after COP26. And so we have this website. It's arranged in 3 sections: Rethink, Reimagine, and to Mobilize. So Rethink is really the ideas behind the competition and the whole idea of the project. You can view the exhibition itself or an additional kind of 70-ish concepts that are more or less practical, more or less fantastic, but that are very, very inspiring. And then in Mobilize, later this year at the time of COP, we'll upload, we're developing a book and what we call a toolbox of practical tools for museums and their partners to use with climate action, because it can seem really complicated. And so these are the 8 exhibits and the core ideas. So they've been developed around a question, not by us, but by the team. So the first one is, well, what if museums became centres for community-led climate research and action, rather than the museum being the hub that broadcasts outwards? What if it worked the other way around? What if it was the community that were the actor, that were working together and collaborating with one another and with researchers to put together the information for others, which is what's housed within the museum? Or another one, this is from Brazil, is a project called Existances, which is a combination of existence and resistance. So indigenous groups and local communities, they have to resist, unfortunately, political circumstances. And we can think that this doesn't just relate to Brazil, but relates very widely. But what if, rather than being big, complicated, and often very elitist places, what if museums were hyper local? They were really small, and they were very much geared around local knowledge and local action, so that the local community can adapt and pass on its traditions and knowledge as that resource for the future, like I mentioned earlier on. So they imagine a building which is a small kind of small dome, like a temporary structure that is both a meeting place and a place where the knowledge is shared and kept alive. And that we're talking here about intangible knowledge, about intangible cultural heritage, which is more around storytelling and oral traditions than material culture. The third one is also from Brazil. So one of the things we are, of course, very aware of is that museums are also very complicit in dispossessing people of their cultural heritage. So we can think that Western museums, including in the UK, are filled with other people's cultural heritage. Some of it not necessarily taken in ways which are even probably legal to, well, certainly not legal today. What if we thought about this in reverse? What if we were to think of the indigenous lands and the people who live in them as the experts in sustainable living? What if we were to think of indigenous territories and people who live in them as a kind of museum for climate action? And I don't mean a museum in that kind of preservation, documenting the past sense, but in the place that helps to imagine and create and resource the future that we need. Or fourthly would be, how can museums support the move to climate-friendly technology and lifestyles? So while it's very common to think of climate action as top-down, technical policies, policy development and policy implementation, as if people are just the kind of like, almost like robots that adopt these policies, and that's just not how people work. Instead, this is an idea from Dundee Museum of Transport. So if Scotland is to be using all electric cars by 2032, what measures need to be put in place from now till then so that people have the skills, knowledge, attitudes, so that they are prepared for that, so that they can be part of that rather than it being something inflicted upon them. And they're also developing moving into a new building, which will be renovated to be low carbon. Then we have one from a team in America called Design Earth, that says, well, what if museums and society were forced to confront their role in climate change? And it's the exhibit that will be at Glasgow Science Centre will be a very fantastic animated film in which a stuffed elephant in a museum, which had a quite tragic ending back in the early 20th century. It imagines that elephant coming to life, going out into the streets and kind of spraying everyone with water to make them wake up to the reality of the world that we live in, and really the very unsustainable structure of society that we live in, of which museums are a part, of course. And then we have one which is very different again from a team in Indonesia. They imagine people using some of the approaches, the practices that people in museums do, but these are done by communities. What if people gathered their own collections and information to support dialogue and climate action? So they imagine community groups coming together, debating together, putting together a kind of collection, and then getting together with others to use this as a form of a kind of cross-society negotiation. And then the last one here is, how can people curate their own climate information to support climate action? And this is from Sarah and her colleagues as they call the StoryWeb team. And so this is like that different sense of curation where people become the curators, but we also unleash the power of the internet, both as a source of information, but also to network with one another, and also to create the story that climate change is a story that involves, climate action is a story that needs all of us, because it's different for everyone. But also to use, in the same way that we might think that policies and treaties are the language and the tools of diplomats, we might think that stories are maybe the tools for the public, for society. And so this is what we're trying to do with this project, to inspire radical climate action in and with museums before, during and after COP26. And that's the end of my presentation, so thank you.
First rule of Zoom, unmute. That was excellent. Thanks very much, Henry. So we've got about kind of 25 minutes for questions and discussion. So you can either kind of raise your blue hand or raise your real hand. I think I can see everyone, or if not, please put your questions in the chat. So while other people are thinking, kind of noting their questions down, I wondered, so I've actually got lots of questions, sorry. But I mean, I was struck by, I suppose, in the kind of the different sustainable development goals, and I suppose promoting sustainable tourism. And so perhaps the tensions in, I suppose, firstly, that perhaps museums are hard to decarbonize, in the fact that, you know, often they may be in heritage buildings, they have kind of collections to preserve and so on. But then also the tension between climate action and kind of, you know, the way that museums may be used to kind of outwardly promote a place, to bring people into that place, and obviously that tourism being vital for local economies and museums themselves.
Yeah, so to say something to that sustainable tourism doesn't, because it is a thing, you know, sustainable tourism is an idea, that it's tourism that benefits both the host community and the visitor. And so what can museums do? So what can we see? This growth of tourism is completely unsustainable. So like, I think it's at the moment, tourism is about 8% of global emissions. It's absolutely enormous. And the heritage sector is part of that often, particularly things like the World Heritage Scheme that UNESCO runs. One of the kind of unanticipated consequences of that is it kind of creates a kind of bucket list almost of places to see before you die. And we could think that this, like the growth of visitors to museums is just another aspect of unsustainable consumption. So museums have become a kind of mass consumption. And in a way, that's just a reflection of the mass consumption that we see in society. And I think, so what can we do about this? It's, well, part of what museums can do around this is to educate people before they travel about, to understand the impacts of their travel on the climate. You know, are they traveling in ways that they would wish, so they even think about their impacts. And I'm not talking about going wherever you want and then doing a bit of offsetting and then feeling fine about it. But I would also say that, like, so when I put up the list of the 7 activities for museums, in the same way as the Sustainable Development Goals are, those are a connected set of 7 activities. So if on the one hand you have a museum saying, oh yeah, we really care about climate change, but on the other hand, but we're going to be like a great big magnet for lots of tourists, that's like a zero-sum game. One cancels the other out. So I think that's why it's really important. So say, like, as museums are to look at their emissions, or scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, like their visitor travel is part of their emission picture. But I think it's many museums aren't even so familiar with what their emissions are, I think it's fair to say. So local tourism is a good thing, I think. Concentrate on local tourism.
Oh, I've got a question from Carly.
Hi, Henry. Thanks very much. My internet connection is a bit dodgy, so I do apologise if you have already said this and I've been unable to hear that. But I suppose a bit linked to what you've just been talking about, I wondered what your thoughts are on fossil fuel company sponsorship in cultural spaces and the campaigns to stop that.
Yeah, so it's quite a complicated question, and well, I think it's a complicated challenge, and I think the answer, I think it depends on where you are. So say if you are a museum in, so the oil museum that I mentioned in Stavanger gets a lot of money from the oil industry. It's not surprising, because Stavanger is like Norway's version of Aberdeen. I think what I would say in that is that within SDG 17, because I like to think in terms of the SDGs, SDGs talks about partnerships for the goals, partnerships for sustainable development. And I think fundraising and sponsorship are a form of partnership. And what I would think is that, well, whether places want to be partnering with industries that are, to be honest, industries of the past, or giving a platform to the industries of the future. So I think it's not, so what do I think of it? I think museums should be careful about how they rely on the public's trust. And I think it's also important that, so say, let's just take the example. So the very obvious example at the moment is the Science Museum, which has an exhibition about carbon capture and storage technology, carbon removal method technology, sponsored by, I think it's by Shell. And it's whether the whole message of that exhibition is getting distracted and diluted because of who the partner is. And so it's very problematic, to be honest. But I think it depends on what other options a place has. But yeah, I think that's what I would say to that. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, that's great to get your take on it.
Thanks. I've got questions and comments from Kay and from Claire. So perhaps if I could invite Kay to bring the discussion first.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed your talk, Henry. So thank you very much for that. It was just some observations really while you were talking about, you know, museums, and thinking again about visitors and hyperlocal communities. So Museum Development Northwest, which is managed by Manchester Museum, we work with a lot of smaller organisations that are quite well embedded within the local communities. And I think you're absolutely right. There's an opportunity now to work with those communities and invite communities in, as well as other partners in the area, to think about climate change, climate action, but also for museums to really understand the needs of their communities and how they're going to be affected or are already affected by climate change, and what they can do to support that. Just understanding those risks and the needs of communities. We've had some really lovely projects over the last 18 months that we've managed to support through grant funding, and we want to see that continue, really.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kay, because I think it's, you know, when we talk about mitigation and adaptation, it relates both to museums as institutions themselves and also to society. So if we think about where can you find out about the climate impacts that might even be already here in your community? It has to be not, you know, there is a great space for more of that, you know, for people to better understand what are the impacts of climate change on where they live already. You know, how are their property and their children's futures going to be affected by these? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Thanks, Henry. Claire, do you want to, Claire Brown?
I'd like to say thanks very much to Henry. Also to apologise in advance. I have an 8-year-old with me who also enjoyed your talk, so thank you very much. Yeah, my question was just about kind of the changing, I guess, scene of museums. I really like the example with the milk platform. So do you think that we'll see a growth in those kind of different takes, I guess, on museums as we move away from a kind of traditional 4 walls and a ceiling?
I think we already are. So there's quite a big debate in the museum sector at the moment about what constitutes a museum. And that partly comes because there are a huge range of, there are online museums, there are museums without collections, there are museums without buildings. And so I think that is already here. I think what I'd sort of add on to that is that there's something that you sometimes hear about in relation to climate action, and they would talk about behavior change, and it's like we need to change people's behavior, and museums slightly slip into that a bit. And I think without meaning to that, I don't know about you, but if I was to go to a building and said we're going to change your behavior, I'd run a mile. It's like we need to also think about, well, on what basis are we doing these things? You know, are we doing these activities? And that's again why I like the Sustainable Development Goals, because the principle is about people's active, free and meaningful participation. It's not about changing someone's behavior, it's about helping them make informed choices. So you either approach it from a kind of deficit model that people don't want to do this and we need to somehow persuade them, or you could have the alternative, much more generous approach, which I'd prefer to take, is that people want to do stuff. They just don't have the opportunities. We need to help them understand the opportunities and create the opportunities. And that was a bit like what we tried to do with that exhibition in 2016 that Sarah was involved in, just to get more people involved in the conversation. That would seem to me a very positive way, but isn't really your normal way a museum often operates. They continue to be quite expert-led, science-led, broadcast models. So we need lots of different approaches.
So I might, while I'm waiting to see if there's more questions, kind of jump in with another question. I'm wholly abusing my right as chair. I mean, I was struck looking at all the different, like how very different all the 8 kind of, the 8 reimaginings of museums that are going to be shown as part of the Reimagining museums competition, kind of how different they all are from each other, from the same starting point, as it were, and actually how exciting some of those ideas are. And so I wondered to what extent those ideas could be supported going forward, you know, to kind of to have a life beyond an exhibition and have a life beyond the concepts in the exhibition, to kind of whether there's any plans to actually work with museums to make some of those ideas happen.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we haven't even really started to capitalize on the on this. I mean, the competition has to be said was very successful, because in May 2020 we even thought, oh well, should we be launching this competition now? And we decided that, well, yes, because a lot of people are looking for something to do, and of course climate change doesn't stop because of COVID, and it actually makes things even harder, because COVID doesn't somehow kind of trump climate change. It just multiplies, these risks multiply with one another. And so the idea of the website, which has the 8 exhibits on it and the 70 plus concepts, they're aimed to be there as a kind of resource, but we do realize that we need to help people to make use of that. So the reason that there are so many ideas on the website is because, as I mentioned before, everyone's context is different. The challenges that they face, the resources they have to address climate change. And so that's why we wanted to give a big range of ideas that people can draw on. We're not thinking that you would take one kind of off the shelf and just do that one. You've maybe drawn a few of different ideas, but it's very up for grabs. It's there as a resource for people, but I agree, we need to help people make use of it.
Oh, and great, thanks, Kay. There's some positive feedback from Kay on the ideas. Yeah, giving museums food for thought in how they operate now and going forward. And I mean, just on that, following up from that point, I mean, obviously Henry and Kay and others kind of working in the museum sector. To what extent is you know, is that visioning and sort of trying to reimagine museums for the future? Is that sort of work that's sort of the sector's looking at, or is it?
Well, what would I say to that? I think it's really different in different places, like really different. So we can see there's definitely a lot of interest, and there was something I mentioned in the talk, is that like ICOM, the big international network, its members adopted this sustainability resolution in 2019. Climate change is pretty much standard material in museum conferences now. But I think we need to start looking at the how. Well, what is it? You know, it's not, should we connect with climate action, or climate change is really important. It's like, okay, so what are we actually going to do? And it needs to be more granular, I think. So like there was a big conference in Washington, DC March before last, looking at the different ways that museums and other forms of cultural institution can support climate action. There are coalitions around the world. There is some museums are going climate neutral, carbon neutral. But there is a lot of work still to do with that. So there is stuff happening, but it happens in lots of different ways in different places.
Could I invite you as well, Kay? You said in the chat that yes, there's lots of food for thought for how museums are operating now and going forward.
Yeah, so we've, again, at Museum Development Northwest, we're funded by Arts Council, managed by Manchester Museum, and we work with about 150 museums across the Northwest. Our priority museums, I would say, are kind of the smaller to medium-sized independent and local authority museums, although we do work with a whole range of museums. And since 2016, we've been working with the Carbon Literacy Trust and delivering carbon literacy training with museums. And part of that one-day training session was around visioning for museums. And it was a really nice opportunity for museums to throw things out the window and try and imagine what they could look like in the future if they were a sort of green museum that were responding to community needs and the sustainable development goals. And we've seen the progression in probably about maybe 10 museums in particular that we've been working with over the last couple of years. On some amazing practice. So Port Sunlight Village Trust, who are a really unusual site because they're a village and a landlord, as well as operating a museum. And they've just finalised their village-wide sustainability action plan, which is absolutely fantastic. Judges Lodgings Museum in Lancaster, which is a local authority run museum, have their own green team now, and they're trying to roll out carbon literacy training themselves to try and get all the staff on board with making changes. I've got the Whitaker in Rosendale, who I know Henry's worked with as well, who have really sort of got a big focus on the climate crisis and climate action in their community. And Brantwood in Coniston as well, which is a historic house, Ruskin's home, who want to set up their own sort of environmental hub for action and climate change on their site as well. So lots of amazing things happening at some smaller and medium-sized museums as well. And we hope to continue to support that. We've just been awarded some funding from Arts Council England for a partnership project with Manchester Museum and Carbon Literacy Trust to expand our carbon literacy work across England, working with our counterpart museum development teams in the 8 other English regions. So yeah, really exciting.
Thanks, Kay. Have I got any other questions or reflections? Awesome, yeah, people enjoying your museum recommendations there, Kay. Thank you very much. So if there's no other further questions and reflections from people here before I close the seminar, can I just sort of hand it back to Henry? I mean, Henry, you talked sort of quite a bit in your presentation about the upcoming COP. What would your key messages to museums be, or to COP itself be ahead of COP and beyond?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that like if we look at like international climate action, like if we look at like the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement, they have an extremely high ambition. If we look at local communities, they also tend to have a very high ambition for their community. If I'm honest, the weak link in that chain is the ambition of national governments. And in a way, we shouldn't just hand over all power to what happens in a conference in Glasgow, because that's not actually how activity happens. Politicians respond to what they think is the demands from the public. And so if we care about climate change or the future, I think the best thing we can do is one, to vote, and secondly is to write to your politician, and 3, make your voice heard. And I don't just mean in the 2 weeks when when COP is in Glasgow. I mean the 365 days of the year, because I think that's how change happens. It doesn't happen through a group of politicians in a conference. It happens in society, and I think the more museums can empower people to understand both the need to act on climate change and other sustainable development issues, to provide them with practical skills and opportunities to make use of their democratic processes and so on. I think that's what I would say, is that climate action isn't just a conference that comes and goes, because I mean, to be honest, COP is also reported in a very often not quite the best way, that every year it'll say, oh, this is the last chance to do this, and then that comes and goes, and then it comes again, oh, this is the last chance to we need to make this stuff 365 days a year. So there was I saw a quip there from Claire that COP's almost a bit like an onion because it makes you cry. It's a very big, slightly dysfunctional conference. You know, like we need to look at taking a bit more control in our own hands, in our own communities, and making sure our representatives work for us.
That's great. That's a brilliant place to finish. Thank you very much, Henry. Because yeah, it's been great. It always gives me kind of hope, and when I hear about the kind of the actions that other people, that everyone is taking really, and the idea that climate action is a 365, something that happens 365 days a year and not just during COP. And I think, I mean, the other thing that I've really taken, away from this as well is the idea that whether we've received the world that we want from the past, and that we need and will the future appreciate what we're passing on to them. So yeah, thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming along. This talk will soon